very, very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your relatively expansive career in the cannabis industry so far?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a total pleasure to be here. Just to give a quick overview of my background, I am, suppose, traditionally trained in terms of school and background in actually health systems and healthcare. I think that was an interesting bridge for me entering the cannabis industry a little over 10 years ago now. I was part of the founding team of Tweed Marijuana in Smith Falls, Ontario, which we then grew over the subsequent 7.5 years I was there into Canopy Growth, which at one point, I think we had over 5,500 employees globally. And the company was certainly looked to as the market leader at the time. I think that, there's been a lot of new entrants, new operators into the market now. So it's a very different landscape than it was, say, even 3 to 4 years ago. But my background being in health systems and health policy, I think has been a huge asset for the work that I've done in cannabis, and then ultimately the work that we do at Foxnrth, just simply because one of the things that's often not considered, especially within the cannabis industry, unfortunately, is that for the most part, outside the United States, cannabis is almost entirely regulated by health systems. And so if you have a really strong understanding of how those systems work, it actually is quite a valuable asset in navigating where rules may shift, where regulations may be laid out. And oftentimes those regulations are quite a bit different than what you would see, say, in a traditional financial sector or even in manufacturing and things like that, just simply because there's such a human factor involved in regulation of healthcare.
So that's certainly something I want to come back to, and it's a really interesting perspective, which I think we don't hear an awful lot of in the industry. Before we go there, do you mind giving us a bit of background into Foxnrth as a company, when, how, and why you launched it, and what progress it's made since you did launch it?
We're kind of a small consulting shop. Foxnrth came out of essentially a group of folks that worked within Canopy. A number of us have actually worked in different markets all around the world. And what we recognized was that many of the smaller operators had a ton of opportunity to enter new markets. The companies that certainly didn't have really heavy balance sheets that they had to manage had a lot more of an ability to be nimble and enter new markets. But the challenge there is that it's also hard to bring in the resources with the experience to actually enter those markets and navigate, slightly different regulations, different rule sets, and ultimately try and establish market share and presence. So what we decided to do was start approaching companies and ultimately take some of the solicitations that we had from folks within our network, and Foxnrth was born. What we've done since really is we focused on kind of 3 main verticals, and I kind of say the 4th vertical is a bit of the auxiliary vertical. One big one being obviously awareness, presence, understanding the broader market. So we work with a number of companies in a number of regions around the world. We provide support to leadership in companies to give them that outside perspective, because oftentimes it's challenging to really see, the forest for the trees, so to speak, especially when you're inside of a company and there's so much pressure and there's a lot of things happening very quickly and things are moving faster than sometimes you may be able to assess. So that's one function, certainly advisory services, which is very traditional consulting. And then we also focus on regulatory advisory. So whether it's specifically making recommendations for companies on how they approach delivering new products, how they approach trying to change rule sets within regulations, and sometimes even political strategies. So we work in that vertical, and that's not just within the North American market, but actually globally. Our function primarily in that exercise is to develop the strategy to work with ultimately lobbyists, folks that have access to politicians and regulators. And so we have a broader network of groups that we work with around the world to ensure that we have that access and deliver those strategies for clients. The last bucket that's not the auxiliary bucket is market building. So our team's experience really has been market building. I was responsible for the first commercial import of cannabis into the United States with the DEA. I've worked with, and our organization's worked with, more than one DEA permit holder in the United States, but I also moved over to Australia to open the canopy growth offices ultimately in Melbourne. And that organization is still doing actually quite well underneath the canopy umbrella. And so we've had quite a bit of experience in a number of markets. We work with operators that are based out of South Africa, operators based out of Australia, Canada, Europe, you name it. And so working with them, we ultimately look for, what will be the best opportunities to enter those new markets. Maybe they need new partners. Maybe they're looking at an asset light model where they don't actually want to have production in market. They want to focus on importing. And those specific wants and needs of our clients really come into how we lay out a plan for approaching that market. And then the last auxiliary bucket, which is the ultimately the branding and licensing aspect of Foxnrth. So we are one of, I believe, 7 exclusive agents of the Greater brand company. And so Greater is an organization of folks that are actually primarily based out of California. The agency itself kind of emerged out of the view that within the celebrity and film and television and music world, there are various different types of agents. There are commercial agents, there are talent agents, there are agents that do specific sponsorships. And for the focus of Greater, the idea was to actually develop an agency that exclusively focused on licensing into cannabis or with cannabis companies. And so what our function is there is really to work with the Greater team. We provide a lot more insight on kind of international expansion, moving different markets forward. And we've worked with, a number of groups from, I'd say, from my time at Canopy, worked directly with the Houseplant team, helped them launch that business, to Snoop and that group, who are also represented by the Greater brand company. And so really kind of try and focus on a bit of a broad swath of different areas that we know that can be beneficial to clients. But really our core focus is really on that regulatory and new market development piece.
Wow. So you've been pretty busy since 2018.
Yeah. It's been fast moving. I think things really picked up in, I'd say, really honestly in the last 2 years. We had a pretty significant presence at South by Southwest in 2021. And from there, it really led to a bit of a snowball effect. So that conference, we had a few panels off the main show, so to speak, just simply because I personally think a lot of the more robust conversations can happen in those environments, especially when you're not on the main stage. It's much easier to communicate to the audience that's right in front of you. So we spent a good amount of time engaging with different companies there, and out of that came a number of opportunities to work with some amazing companies. One of which is a company called Drink Modern, who has developed effectively a dispensing machine for cannabis beverages that is able to mix those beverages in line. And so we're working really closely with them on essentially taking something that didn't exist 6 months ago. Well, it existed 6 months ago, but it wasn't publicly demonstrated 6 months ago. We're taking something that regulators didn't know existed, really is the best way to put it. And we're taking that and helping them understand, hey, this thing exists. This can solve a ton of your challenges in terms of on-premise consumption dispensing. Hey, it also actually solves for a lot of the economics and challenges of dispensing cans, which includes storage, cost, weight and freight, all those types of things. So, so really in the last 2 years has been, I think, a bit more of a rocket ship exercise as we've, ultimately come out of more of the social isolation that was a product of COVID.
So there's a pretty thorough run through of your kind of core values and your business operations as it stands right now. I wonder where you're looking into the future. What markets are exciting for you? What are your kind of goals in terms of the things that are moving in the sector at the moment. You know, it's a pretty tough time for a lot of companies. I wonder where Foxnrth is looking ahead.
Yeah, I think so. There's a number of pieces that I think really do need to be considered. I think one is um, understanding kind of the global market of cannabis, and I think that this is where we are kind of in the start-stop exercise of, you know, protectionist policy versus importation, and understanding that the economics of growing cannabis globally, both from you know, ultimately a cost perspective, but also from a sustainability perspective, is really going to lead to some extent, a drive towards commoditization. So really looking at those regions where you can produce cannabis at a very low cost, at very low risk in terms of, you know, weather patterns that can wipe out outdoor crops, or you know, soft shell greenhouses. And so that's places like places in the equatorial regions, like South Africa, Lesotho. That's places like Colombia, and that's, you know, that's potentially places through Southeast Asia as well. And I look at the broader globe, and I look at how cannabis is being produced, and some of the more successful companies in North America, in Europe, even in Australia, are companies that are not growing the plant directly themselves. They're recognizing that this is actually an emerging global supply chain. They're identifying really strong sources for those products, and they're probably doing, in a lot of cases, their own post-manufacturing and processing. And that's really, when you look at kind of traditional commoditization, you know, you buy your coffee beans from these regions that are equatorial, but they're roasted and processed and packaged and turned into new products ultimately within the, you know, the regions where they're sold. So, you know, there's tons of roasters across North America. Well, they buy that commodity of coffee from an equatorial region. Could they grow it in some? Yeah, I'm sure that you could come up with a way to create some microclimates that allow you to do it. But the truth is, it doesn't make sense economically or from an environmental perspective. So one of the big trends I see, and this is a slow moving ship. This is not something that it's going to be flash in the pan overnight. But I think over the next 5 years, I think there's going to be a pretty steady shift. I think that potentially could be driven by the emergence of the European market. I think that the European market is going to be a slow, steady climb towards opening up around cannabis. The big thing that is, I think, disappointed a lot of folks about the German pilot, and how Germany is kind of approaching in a very slow manner how they want to think about legalization, is that Germany was never going to change the way that the United States does. And that's one of the big things that I think a lot of folks don't really understand, is in the United States, cannabis isn't regulated outside of the federal system, which is very unique and specific. It isn't regulated as a health product. It's not regulated through healthcare systems. And so there isn't all of the additional considerations and factors, because remember, the health systems of these countries, their responsibilities really are to ensure the health and safety of the population. And with a product that has potential risks, they're not going to approach that lightly. And I think, we look at other products that are available for inebriation or in consumption, and recognize that alcohol, I'm sure if we were looking at alcohol from zero right now, I don't know that it would be something that would be as broadly available as it is. But it's something that has ultimately had this kind of grandfathering in. And I think we would like to think that as new products come to the market, the same level of scrutiny be provided, so that it allows for a really healthy, sustainable industry going forward. So I think that kind of commoditization, emergence of those products is going to be a big one, especially as you see some of these companies that are in these equatorial regions, or companies that are working with European partners, actually getting EU GMP, certifications, and are able to import into that market and not be restricted. And so I think it's just a steady march in that direction. The other kind of trend I think is important to think about is really a level setting on the scale of the cannabis industry globally. I think that cannabis is a very healthy business. I think that it is a space that you can actually enter and do very well in terms of growing your operations and growing a business. But I do also think that there is a kind of a false ceiling, so to speak, in terms of where the cannabis industry or the scale of the economics of cannabis actually really should be projected. And I think that comes back to the early projections from the Canadian market, right? The Canadian market was projecting numbers in the 20 billion range for the sale of cannabis. And when you think about it, that didn't factor in, the premium that was paid for illicit access. It didn't factor in the costs of regulation. It didn't factor in the reduction in revenue from taxation. It didn't factor in, any number of pieces that really limited the growth of that industry. And so what it turned out to be is about 1/5 of that. It turned out to be about a $4 to $5 billion industry as it stands right now. And I think that we're still seeing new markets extrapolate on those original Canadian numbers, as opposed to looking at those numbers and saying, okay, let's reevaluate and see where this market can go. And then the next piece on top of that too, is you're looking at other markets, is understand that Canadians consume more cannabis per capita than any other country in the world. So the adoption rate is going to be much different from country to country too. So with all that said, the industry itself, we have a lot of folks that have invested in mountains and mountains of capital into growing large scale businesses, large scale production sites. And as a result of that, they're carrying enormous amounts of debt. And do I have a theory on what those companies are going to be able to achieve, with that debt and trying to keep that serviced or restructure it? Honestly, I don't. That's not really where we focus. Where we would focus is more on looking at the smaller operators and how much of an opportunity there is for companies that are not debt laden. And when I say debt laden, I don't mean that you owe a couple $1 million to creditors or to investors. I mean hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of millions of dollars being paid out on a monthly basis to service debt. Those are debt laden operations. And I think the smaller kind of organically growing businesses that we see from market to market have huge opportunities in scaling. And I think it really is just a matter of kind of the rule set kind of catching up. And it seems to me, regardless of who I talk to, that the bellwether for that is around American prohibition. And so if we see some changes in the way that finances work in the American market, there's a lot of view from investors and from the capital side of things that more money will come into the sector and really, really boost it. So, fingers crossed that we see some changes in the American market, because that's where a lot of the investment is focused. But at the same time, I do still think that there is, tons of opportunities for these businesses to grow in a healthy way within the markets that they already operate.
So zooming back in slightly into kind of Foxnrth and its operations and ethos, doing a bit of research, I came across what's referred to as the systems approach numerous times. Are you able to explain to us what the systems approach is, kind of where it lies within your company?
Yeah, absolutely. So the systems approach really is born out of the health system side of things, and really understanding that when you look at a publicly funded health system, whether it's, the NHS, whether it's the Canadian health system, whether it's Medicare and Medicaid in the United States, fun fact, the United States pays more per capita for healthcare, publicly funded healthcare, than Canada does. And not a lot of people know that, but regardless, within these broader systems, there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of factors that need to be considered. And we essentially take the same lens and apply it to the work that we do. So when we look at, say, a business that wants to launch a new product in a market, we don't just look at it and say, okay, is that product permissible? Great. Now let's tick the boxes of packaging, let's tick the boxes of, COAs and all the necessary testing. And then let's just launch it. Let's get it onto a dispensary listing or to a distribution list and get that product in market. From our perspective, the way we think about it is we look at the product and we say, okay, what is the product servicing in terms of the broader population of that market? Let's look at what products would ultimately compete with this. And then we zoom out. Instead of focusing more and more on, okay, this is exactly how we want to do it, we take that, the competitive landscape, so to speak, and then we look at additional factors that are leading to that. So we may have a leader that's got market share in this specific product, but that market share may be a product of a endorsement that they have from a celebrity, or it may be a product of the fact that they're a very dominant local brand and they've emerged in a very organic way. And so competing with them may be a bit different. And so very much the view with the systems approach from our perspective is that there's never one factor that's leading to an outcome. There's always more than one. And within healthcare, in the broad sense, those factors can be political, they can be policy driven, they can be bureaucratic, they can be publicly driven, they could be expertise driven. So, one factor that not a lot of people think about is that within healthcare systems, one of the loudest and most outsized voices is in terms of the broader population are the health professionals. And I say that not to say that health professionals control these systems. They certainly are not in charge of any specific thing. That tends to be more of a political exercise. And certainly they fight very hard for, access and equity and all the pieces that they need to operate. But when I use that example, I immediately think about the German market, and I think about the role of pharmacy in the German market. And I think about the role of pharmacy in the economics of the German market. And that's not something that really is broadly understood outside of Germany, or with companies that actually work in Germany. Those are the folks that get it. They've actually spent some time there. They realize that there is a substantial margin increase to their products that they do not see, because the distribution channels in Germany go through pharmacies, and pharmacies ultimately have the ability to apply additional costs to these things for either the insurers or for individuals that are paying out of pocket. That's a systems function that really, if you're not considering it in terms of how you plan to enter the German market, you don't realize that, the product that you're selling for $5 is actually going to cost 10 at the end of the line, because there is actually legislative precedent that allows for pharmacists to mark up products up to 100%. So that's just kind of a basic example, but it gives you an example that's tangible within, the global cannabis industry, that these things are factors that really will affect the cost of product, the adoption of product. Knowing that the cost of product is effectively doubled for medical patients before they receive it is going to change how you think about the economics of your product in going into a market. And that's not something that you're going to think about immediately. You're only really going to understand that as, the product flows and you maybe don't see the uptake that you thought you would.
So this year's Cannabis Europa, there was a lot of talk about kind of stagnation across the medical cannabis industry in Europe, and a bit of a frustration, I guess, at the lack of progress that had been made over the last few years. In your view, what do you think the industry needs to kind of kickstart it again, get this momentum building? And do you think it relates to your kind of previous point about really understanding these various health systems?
Yeah, so I do. I think that there's a couple factors. So one example that's also kind of a systems one is, in terms of at least perspective, is looking at the UK and looking at the conversations that a lot of operators are having in the UK about the potential of the market, right? That there is vocal voices that are saying, hey, government, support this industry. The potential of this industry is X number of dollars. Look at what we can do as a UK cannabis industry. Well, if you pause for a second and think about this through the lens of the NHS, and think about cannabis as a medical substance, or a drug substance, or however you want to be classified, well, the NHS pays for that. So when the NHS hears it's going to be a $20 billion industry, or a $4 billion industry, or whatever number you want to apply to it, there's a different perspective, which is this industry is going to cost us $4 billion of product moving through our publicly funded, drug plants. And so there's a little bit of, I think, perspective shift that kind of needs to kind of be factored into how people are thinking about how they engage with operators and regulators, and also on the political level as well. But I look at Europe really is in kind of the same cycle that the Canadian market was in, and that the US market was in. Things have moved much more quickly because there's a lot more of a consideration for the medical applications of cannabis. But in the same way that these markets and these governments have moved quickly to afford medical access out of compassion, out of a recognition that, hey, maybe prohibition is a little bit heavy-handed and maybe a little absurd. They're also using kind of the same kind of compassion, so to speak, or the same concern for people needing to get access to a medical substance in the opposite direction as they consider a recreational path. And I think that when you look at we look at the one major commercialized federal legal system, which is the Canadian market, a lot of folks don't realize that it wasn't an overnight exercise. This was almost a 20-year journey from the first court decision to allow medical access through to a thriving medical home grow production system, to then subsequently a commercial system that then got turned into a commercial recreational system. So it wasn't a short timeline. And I think that when you see changes happen really quickly in some of the emerging markets, you realize like, okay, this timeline could be shorter, but at the same time, Canada took 20 years to decide to legalize. There's 20 years of essentially, public health data around cannabis consumed illicitly for the country to be able to make those decisions. But I kind of give this roundabout thing to say that if we look at kind of the opportunity in some of these markets and we look at, what could be viable for them, I think the conversation around medical access needs to remain super important because that's what's resonating with regulators. But the momentum around kind of recreational or broad-based access is something that I think really needs to come from the populace, right? From the electorate, from people that want to see this change happen. And I think that there's a lot of engagement in the European market from North American operators and North American, money that is invested in businesses that operate in cannabis. And I think one of the things that's kind of running up against the momentum of recreational legalization is that adoption isn't ultimately as high in European markets as it is in North America in terms of consumption population. And so that's something also that, really does need to be considered more broadly. But I look at European cannabis and I think there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of excitement because Germany said we're going to consider legalization, and all this talk because Germany really is one of the main pillars of the whole European bloc, is that if that changes, well, then the European Union will have to change their rule set, and then ultimately we'll have a bit of a domino across Europe as far as countries coming online. And I think that what's happened, which is a much more cautious approach to legalization and a studying of that, is really ultimately completely in line with how a health systems approach would be taken to cannabis and cannabis legalization. I think that nothing that we're seeing right now says to me that we're not progressing towards legalization in these markets. I just think that the frustration and the challenge here is that the timelines are longer than one would think. And, in the end, unfortunately for European operators and companies outside of North America, the companies in North America had a huge opportunity to do a ton of research, to really start to develop huge data sets that could explain to regulators and explain to governments, this is safe. This is something that is not going to increase risk in road safety, dependency. It's going to decrease youth access, because these are all, I'm not making points up now. These are things that are a product of the Canadian system at post-legalization. If we had more effort ultimately from North American operators, companies that I worked for and worked in, to actually, collect that information, report it out, and make a much bigger case for it, I think that, regulators outside of North America could be more informed and could make decisions more quickly. But unfortunately, that kind of study hasn't necessarily happened. It doesn't. I don't personally think that it's a closed door either. I think that if governments wanted to study how the Canadian market has ultimately rolled out, absorbed, and introduced cannabis as a recreational substance that's available and is as ubiquitous as, it's actually more available to some extent than alcohol is, in terms of the access points. Although it's not blasted all over TV as something that's going to make your life better the way alcohol is. So when you look at the Canadian market, it's a really good example for regulators to consider, and ultimately you could look at it and say, we could run a study on that market and say, okay, these 5 products that we want to consider for Germany or for Czechia or for, France, let's see what those 5 products are doing in this market. Let's see what the downstream effect is for consumers of those products. What are the adverse event reports on those products? And these things can ultimately inform decisions. I think that if I'm going to point on one thing overall that I think is limiting the progress of cannabis globally, it's that everybody's really trying to do it in an insular, domestic protectionist way. And that's ultimately, I think, born out of the way that Canada did it. But the difference being that Canada was the only one. And I think that if everybody started to have more of a broad conversation about opening up import, export, but also information and data, we could see kind of more of a change, more of a sea change as far as cannabis legalization is concerned globally.
So is it partly for businesses a bit of an optics issue? Do they need to would it help them to understand these internal systems a lot better to position themselves for policymakers? And how does that differ between positioning themselves with policymakers and like the medical community, for instance? You mentioned the NHS already. Mm-hmm. How does that differ in terms of how businesses should be presenting themselves to these different parties?
Yeah, I think that, so one thing that I found somewhat interesting, I personally don't have a concrete view either way. I think that with cannabis, because it's such a complicated product, industry, topic, you name it, with prohibition, with historical legacy access, with the use of cannabis for oppressive means, the relationship that cannabis has as a traffic substance associated with other far more dangerous and troubling crimes. There's so much wrapped up in cannabis that it's not a simple one channel issue. And what I do often find in terms of when I'm looking at different industry in different markets is that the industry associations that exist, the groups that are actually moving the agenda forward for cannabis, they're very important because not every company has the resources to mount up a government relations team or engage in lobbying or do things that would involve government influence and trying to support their business. So these industry associations that come together as a group of individuals is very important. But what I've found is that the industry associations have unique internal challenges, which almost restrict their ability to deliver a straightforward, cohesive message directly to lawmakers. So the example I'll give is in the Canadian system, this is consistent in the United States, and I'm sure that it's consistent in other industry associations, is the license threshold. So the idea that all the companies that have applied or want to be cannabis companies are part of this industry association, but some of them have licenses and some of them don't. Well, the traditional kind of regulatory business ethos around that is that those two groups are completely at odds with each other. Because one of the biggest advantages of the companies that have licenses is that they have the licenses. And one of the biggest disadvantages of the companies that don't is that they don't. And so the companies that have the licenses don't want more. And the companies that don't have licenses ultimately want licenses. So you have this almost central issue within an industry group that is conflicted. And so you unfortunately are challenged to even deliver a clear, straightforward message that everybody's bought into. And I do think that that's that is one of those areas where if we had a little more cohesion with the messages that are being delivered by groups, we'd see, a fairly substantial, difference in terms of the message that politicians are operating with and understanding. And also you could get a little bit more creative in terms of how those things are delivered. You could have a little bit more consistency of message in those exercises. So that's, I think, one area where I think industry can really improve how it's engaging with government. The other area, I think, in terms of trying to advance, I suppose, cannabis as an industry, depending on which markets you're looking at, is really to kind of take and understand that there is a version of cannabis that has been presented as, this almost like tech, like that this is going to be like Facebook or these big speculative companies that we just put some money in now, or we invest now, and then at scale, the money machine will all of a sudden turn on and there's going to be huge volumes. And I think that one of the things that I've learned, at least over the last 10 years working with companies, is the folks that think about growing their business in a more organic way, meaning that focusing on more of a local community, developing trust and developing, net promotion out of that community. And I don't mean just like, your neighborhood, but I mean within, your social community, whether it's digital or otherwise, or it may be an interest community that you've worked hard to associate with the brand or with the products that you're selling. Those companies can start to kind of slowly compound what they've done and emerge as ultimately really healthy, maybe they're not billion-dollar companies, but they are $50 to $100 million companies, which is a very healthy and successful company. And I think there's a little bit of a level set in understanding the scale of what the industry is capable of doing, that I think when that can be kind of factored into how companies are approaching government, the asks can be really more realistic, and we can have conversations about, tax abatements over certain periods of time that then can be run out as businesses get healthier. Kind of, you name it, it's a little bit all over the map. That answer your question? I feel like I might not have landed completely on the bullseye there.
No, absolutely. And I guess to wrap up, you've touched on this fairly heavily already, but I wanted to kind of boil it down and see if there are any kind of key points that you think European industry can gain from looking very closely at what happened in Canada and the US. Obviously, there's lots of lessons to learn. You've already mentioned that studying that will be a great benefit. But I wonder if there are any sort of key bullet points that you think we should really be focusing on.
Yeah. So I think that's, it's a great question. And I think there's a couple areas. One is, I think I'll go back to my kind of first comment, which is around the trends in the global market and the idea of commoditization and the movement of cannabis in that direction. The reason I say that is that, let's be perfectly honest, growing cannabis indoors in a country like Canada or across most of Europe that has, a decent winter is wild. Like it's not the best idea. It's certainly not sustainable with the amount of power costs, HVAC requirements, you name it, that's involved in growing these things indoors, when you could grow it in an equatorial region all year round at, a fraction of the cost. And still, if you are investing time in those areas, bring the product to a level that is ultimately the same as what you'd be producing in, in kind of the, the more polar regions. So one thing that I think is, one thing that if I'm a European operator, if I'm in the UK, if I'm in Germany, or if I'm in one of the more emerging markets, my thinking would be, how do I find a source of lower cost product? And instead of spending all of my time and money on building out a facility and trying to grow things indoors and introduce it, and then make really my position as a company, we're domestic, we grow our product here, this is what we do. And then the subsequent, campaign or the subsequent government engagement from that needs to be, hey, don't allow import. Hey, ensure certain, new thresholds need to be met for imported product. And ultimately you're kind of constricting the market as much as you can for your business's benefit. Whereas if you look at it the complete opposite way, which is don't necessarily spend all that money to grow all that stuff. Instead, spend that effort and some of those resources in trying to open up channels for importation and open up channels for product that is lower cost, and then focus on processing and adding value in your market that doesn't involve, these astronomical energy bills, tons of lights being on, HVACs, you name it. But instead, you're talking about, adding the value in a GMP environment. So you're really putting a quality stamp on that, but you're not over investing, and you're not adding things that, from a vertical integration perspective, are just going to be draws on areas that are profitable. Like when you look at the vertical integration stack of the Canadian companies that are unfortunately starting to recede into the background, they were a bit of a victim of how the regulations were laid out and how the rule set was introduced in Canada, which is you had to be everything. And I think that if there's anything that people seem to be looking at Canada for, is that that's the model. It's not. Being everything is not the way that you can be successful in cannabis. In fact, it is ultimately the most challenging way to be successful in the cannabis industry. If you can choose a portion of that value chain, focus very heavily on that, you can actually be very successful. And so when it comes to new emerging markets that don't have a huge built out domestic production environment, I wouldn't recommend investing in. I would recommend investing in accessing commodity product, because your costs are going to be way lower. You're going to be able to actually create a healthier legal market as a country. Like if Canada could import product from Colombia and Lesotho, all of these countries of which Canadian companies at one point went to, invested tons of money to help develop production. If that product could be imported in the country, you'd be dropping the cost of, the cost per gram from $3 to $4 wholesale for something, high quality, down to, 10 to 15 cents per gram. And when you think about those economics and you realize, like, one of the biggest challenges in Canada is that the taxation on the product leaves almost nothing for companies to actually turn a profit on, outside of the medical system, which seems to be keeping some companies healthy. You realize, like, the difference in the commodity cost before wholesale is the difference maker between, strong profitability and barely scraping by. So if I'm looking at it, and if I'm looking at it as a European company, I would say focus more on how you can build these businesses as asset light, and encourage your governments to be more open to the amount of the product that can come in, as opposed, and set standards, have requirements, no issue with that. But certainly don't close doors to the, the transit of cannabis globally, because at the end of the day, if they're all open, it's a much more sustainable industry, both from an economic perspective, but also from an environmental one. Because this is just kind of the footnote that I'll cap this off. We are talking about a time where climate change is at the forefront, and that, carbon taxes are being laid across the globe, and the use of energy to do things is being reevaluated and reconsidered. The idea that I'm going to use, the same amount of energy as a small city to grow a weed indoors in the middle of winter in Canada is arguably one of the least sustainable things that I can do. So, those are things that should be considered. And I think if governments really start to progress to more heavy-handed climate change and sustainability policies, as a cannabis company, you can expect to see more cost added to your production, because you're growing indoors, you're running lights, you're using a ton of power. So that, I think, kind of sums it up, but really very much think asset light. There's a lot of companies out there that can supply you, that can work with you, and that, that can help you build a healthy business that's not going to be bogged down by a lot of the the baggage that vertical integration or debt service seems to be having for a lot of the larger companies.
Fascinating stuff. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Ben. Appreciate it.